Many of you who are involved, obviously, in this rates issue are aware that it's a very, very, very slow-moving process with not a whole lot of reward so far at the end of it. Ultimately, I've seen other presentations now talking about lengths of time on board Planola, etc. And it seems like a long time. 100 weeks sounds like a very, very long time to get a decision through. But if I told you that I started at this over 5 years ago and still don't have any decisions, that might seem like an awful lot longer, because it is. I'd ask you to bear in mind this quotation for everything that I'm about to say. And I'm going to give you a moment to read it yourselves. The reality is, this is what my day-to-day life is. Every day, all day. And I'll leave a moment to let that sink in, because it's crucial here. I'll skip on. Okay, so most of you know rates as a tax on commercial property. That's fundamentally what it is. Some of you might not know that really the local authority has very limited power in that circumstance. All they do is they set a number, i.e. 50 million, 100 million, 150 million that they need to collect, and they allow the valuation office to do rental valuations in order to arrive at a uniform figure that they can apply to all those valuations to raise that money. So basically, the local authorities have very little to do with these assessments, other than to say, here's the amount of your rates, you must pay it, it's due today, give me it now. The rental valuations is obviously the bit that you can essentially fight, take issue with, potentially change, and that's what changes the liability. That's obviously where the problem has been, because changing these liabilities has been next to near impossible. So, the State Valuation Office must raise a rental assessment. Now, obviously, most wind farmers understand the concept of rent very simply as the rent that's payable on the land underneath the project. Many people will own the land, but a lot of people will also rent the land from various different landholders. And I'm familiar with projects where there's maybe 20 or 30 different landholders where leases are held under. But that is not the rental equation which the Valuation Office seek to use in doing this exercise. What you are doing is coming up with a notional rent for the project as it sits there, i.e. the turbines, the land, and all of the infrastructure that goes with that. What is that worth in a rent? And I actively encourage you to go on daft.ie at this current moment in time, see if there's any projects available to let on that basis. There aren't. This is a totally conceptual idea. It's completely abstract, which is why I started with that quotation from China Light and Power, because ultimately there is no right answer and there is no wrong answer to this problem, and that is where the fundamental lies. In order to reach a rent, a notional one, where there is no rental evidence, there are ostensibly two methods. One is to say, how much does it cost to put there? And I think if I took a straw poll amongst all of you, none of you would say wind energy was a cheap business to be in. If you do, please come and talk to me afterwards. I have a lot of people who want to talk to you. So therefore, doing a valuation on a contractor's cost basis, i.e. the construction cost, will tend to work out at quite a high figure. The other alternative is to do the receipts and expenditure, i.e. to look at what the project takes in on an annual basis in revenue, discount the costs, and then divide what's left between a hypothetical tenant and a hypothetical landlord. That's the method which the tribunal and the commissioner are essentially going with, and that's what I'm going to spend my time on. But ostensibly, all you need to know about the two methods is both end up in telephone numbers. They're problematic. The real problem with the system more generally for wind is the fact that the most stressful times, by and large, for 95% of farmers, are in the pre-construction and the construction stages. And ultimately, whatever rental calculation you're doing, it can't take any account of that. It can't take any account of the amount of effort that it took to put up. Indeed, if anything, the more time and effort you invest into something in a construction phase, the more rent you're going to need when it's finished. So it invariably infers a high figure. So the receipts and expenditure. This is what the tribunal has spent the last 3 years fixating over in these cases is what the Commissioner has spent the last 5 years fixating over in these cases. At its core fundamental, it's actually very, very, very simple. That is to say, you have income, you have expenditure, you have divisible balance. That is to say, the split between the landlord and the tenant. And then you stand back and you look at the end and you say, is this a fair rent for the property that I have? In reality, there's an awful lot more processes within those stages, which is what complicates things effectively. So, the theory of income, not too tricky, has to be said. Hypothetical megawatt hours generated times a hypothetical contract price. The question is, where do you take your megawatt hours from? Where do you take your price from? So the hours, in generally, relatively simple and straightforward. You average the most recent 3 years or the 3 years prior to the valuation date. Now, obviously, in given projects, that can cause individual issues where they're disproportionately high or disproportionately low. The valuation office will tend to defer to wind reports in those situations, but otherwise it's normally just an average. The price you get is probably a little bit more conceptual, in that what the Commissioner wants to do is come up with a system that works for everybody, which means it works for nobody, basically. But as a consequence, what they're trying to do is come up with a hypothetical value rate per megawatt hour that would apply to everybody, or at least everybody in small wind and everybody in large wind, and then another division between refit and non-refit. So there's kind of subplots, but essentially what they're trying to do is come up with a uniform figure that can just apply to every megawatt hour everybody generates. Basically, the problems with this are numerous, but starting with obviously curtailment and constraint, which is becoming increasingly prevalent in the market. The Commissioner really hasn't got to grips with that. He always works 2 or 3 years behind, and so he's very slow to get to that. As I say already, the question of, is it a true reflection, the 3 years that they're using? And then obviously in regards to the contract price, because each individual project is going to have a contract price, but that's not necessarily what they're looking at. What they're trying to do is come up with a uniform value. And as such, there's no account yet of ISEM, which is obviously a major problem in the market, has reduced payments by circa 5%. And tribunal decisions to date have been very unhelpful on the balancing payment. Essentially, what the tribunal would do, if left to its own devices, is fix the refit reference price plus 100% of the balancing payment, and that would be your hypothetical revenue stream. Now, there are a very small number of projects, to my knowledge, that can achieve that, but in the main, most projects cannot. Indeed, if the supply company is giving 100% of the balancing away, the supply company is essentially earning nothing from the deal. So that seems illogical in the vast majority of cases. So, expenditure. This is the bit, in my experience, that tends to get wind farmers' backs up most. But expenditure is the expenditure of a tenant. It's not the expenditure of you as the occupier. That's the most difficult bit probably to get your head around, and equally the most difficult bit when we talk about what they include and exclude. So, for example, any cost of finance, be it loans to banks, investors, doesn't matter who you've got loans to, that can't count, doesn't count in the expenditure column. Depreciation, technically speaking, doesn't count either. It's replaced by way of what they call a sinking fund to replace the asset at the end of its life. But the actual depreciation you have in your accounts, no, gone. Rent for land, gone. They're coming up with a figure that includes the rent on the land. So if you're paying a rent on the land, that must come out, it must be part of the end. And then a director's remuneration. So say you've managed to actually get your project to the point where it is properly profitable after 13, 14, 15 years, and you're finally paying yourself a proper salary, that goes too. Because ultimately, that wouldn't be what the tenant would pay himself in the same situation. So as you can imagine, this tends to cause a fairly decent amount of problems, because they are most of the significant costs attached to a wind farm all disappearing before your very eyes. So, yeah, the problems, I think I've probably mainly covered that. The Commissioner, again, in this circumstance, is looking for a uniform rate. What he's trying to do is say costs are equal to 15 or 16 euros a megawatt hour. In reality, projects are probably not so easily divided in that way, albeit that there will be somewhat of a happy medium. My own opinion is that it's not necessarily at 15, 16 euros a megawatt hour, it's probably more like 20, but even within individual projects, there's quite a wide variety, and also highly dependent on wages, etc., and who's hired by the business. So the big two sticking points on costs are essentially hypothetical ones, and this is a divergence between the Commissioner and the Tribunal. The Tribunal wishes to apply a sinking fund over 15 years, i.e. the length of refit. The less years you devalue it over, the higher the sinking fund, hence the lower the rates assessment ultimately ends up, so the less years is better. The Commissioner has fixed himself at 20 years, he isn't shifting, and he's prepared to continue to appeal decisions of the Tribunal to the High Court on this point, so he just keeps going. He's also brought in a new thing as of this most recent revaluation, if things weren't bad enough, to cap what they call tenants' chattels. That's normally for the tenants' input into physical infrastructure on a project at €100,000, having been previously €12,500 a megawatt, regardless of how large the project was. So the divisible balance, once you take your income and you take away your costs, you're down to the divisible balance. And this is the bit that must be split between the landlord as rent and the tenant as profit for running the wind farm. Because obviously you as the landlord are just sitting there collecting the rent, the tenant must take a share to run the wind farm. So this, again, highly conceptual in nature. In our experience, these kind of deals don't get done. And if they did get done, people would shake hands at 50-50, because realistically it's the only way to actually do a deal is to say, well, you get the same as I do, and so we both walk away with the same. Obviously there is precedent with various different other industries. There aren't too many done on a strict or any basis the way wind farms are done, but nursing homes are done 55-45, toll roads are done 90-10. That's obviously in favour of the landlord. The higher the landlord share, the higher the rates bill. So what you actually want to do, perversely almost, is make sure that the tenant has a massive share of what's left in the divisible balance, as opposed to you, the landlord, who's paying the rates thereon. So the Commissioner originally did 70-30, the Tribunal went to 65-35 and went as far as 60-40 on a single turbine project. There's a little bit of grey about whether a 2-turbine project or ultimately a small wind project below 5 megawatts could still be done at 60-40. Doesn't make a whole lot of difference in the overall calculation, but it's out there. We're on the fence. I think they'll ultimately go to 65-35 on it, in line with every other project, but it's still a possibility they'll go the other way. The Commissioner again has refused to accept the Tribunal's judgments on 65-35 or indeed 60-40, and is appealing to the High Court on that basis. As I say, 50-50 in the real world is probably what would be done if it were ever done. So, standing back and looking, so this is pretty nebulous, but in theory you get out to a figure at the end that the landlord would get as rent. Let's call it 500,000. What you've got to do in theory is stand back from that and say, well, would somebody, if I put this up on Daft, come to me and say, I'll give you 500,000 for this? And if you feel they wouldn't, well, then you've got to look at it again and say, all right, well, could we do this a different way that comes up with a different figure, or can we build into this method something that alters the figure, either up or down? It doesn't mean that you won't look at a figure coming out at the end of this exercise and say, Jesus, it must be worth more than that. So the problem with this is that nobody wants to do this exercise because it's difficult, plain and simple. The Commissioner, and to a certain extent the Tribunal, want to simply compare wind farms with other wind farms. So in other words, if you design a system to value wind farms and compare them with other wind farms designed on that system, well, guess what? It's all over, because there's no change within that system if you're simply comparing with other things that are done on that same system. The main problem that I have with it, and by consequence obviously the industry has with it, is that wind is being valued at 200 to 300% more than every other type of power generation. And that's a fact arising out of the method. We still don't have all the facts in regards to how the others are even done, or how they might relate in the same basis. But what we can say as a fact, when we stand back from it all, is that if I had a conventional heat and power generation, that I'd be paying somewhere between 50% and 33% of the wind farm with the same capacity. So to my mind, that seems absolutely insane, but the Commissioner doesn't seem to see any problem with it, and the Tribunal hasn't yet seen any particular problem with it. So we are literally perhaps pissing into the wind on that. But it is been a major problem for me, and a major problem I've certainly know for my clients. So this is just a table. I'm not going to read you through everything on this table because I'll be here for a week, but it's probably for your own use to take away later on to give you a more technical basis to how you might construct something if you were doing one of your own projects, perhaps. And that is me.